Armored Core 4 is the game that killed the franchise. And it did so by overhauling the entire thing. Structurally, things are very similar to what we've seen before, but the minutiae of the presentation is where everything is different. We still swap between the mission mech customization screens and the actual missions, but since we're using a new engine, everything had to be rebuilt from the ground up, and the brain trust over at FromSoftware decided to actually use the opportunity to not just do what they had done before, but to figure out what Armored Core would be like if it had to exist and compete within the paradigm of the 7th console generation. It launched in 2006, so the trends which characterized this era of military action games had not yet been established, making this game a very interesting time capsule, because it is an actual bona fide 7th generation action game which was built to bring the gameplay from the 5th generation up to snuff. There are big changes to the core conceptualizations of the license, and this game plays completely differently from what the Armored Cores did before, but it's still harkening back to the Armored Core ethos, and that really makes it stand out from the other military action games of this era. Hi, this is AesirAesthetics asking you, if you liked the video, to comment with some of your own thoughts on the game as we proceed, because even the time I've relegated to this video will not be enough to touch on everything. Also, this is the 4th video in a series I'm doing on the entire Armored Core franchise, and if you haven't already, I'd recommend starting by watching the previous videos I did, because I'll be building on top of a lot of the ideas I talked about there. Now then, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. With Armored Core 4, the franchise made the leap to the 7th generation. The game actually launched on December 21st, 2006, which is notable because the mighty PlayStation 3 had launched on November 11th the same year. I feel like I keep talking about it in these videos, but FromSoftware keeps releasing console launch titles. Anyways, with Armored Core 4 we see the return of long-running series staple in Toshifumi Nabeshima. He actually directed the first game and served as producer on various subsequent titles. He would produce every Armored Core after this one until Fires of Rubicon. He actually left FromSoft before that game, and he made the Left Alive stealth mech game from 2019, which wasn't exactly stellar, if reviews are anything to go by, though it did have some gorgeous Yoshi Shinkawa cover art. I don't think it's a stretch to think he maybe left FromSoft because he saw they weren't gonna make another Armored Core game, though he might have left when the upper management shuffling around fiasco happened and someone else was elevated to be president over many staffers who'd been working there a lot longer than that someone else had. In a twist which will surprise no one, the man chosen was actually the director of this game. Up until this title, Hidetaka Miyazaki's resume lists planner on Armored Core Last Raven. But even as early as Armored Core 4, you can see that this is the guy who would later direct Demon's Souls. He hasn't come into his own as a director yet, and you can kind of feel Nabeshima's hand on top of him because there are certain design decisions which I don't feel are very indicative of the Miyazaki we know now. Armored Core was the cash cow of the studio for the longest time, and they wouldn't just give Miyazaki, who joined the company 2 years before this game was released, they wouldn't just give him a free hand because they absolutely needed to keep the money coming. When it came to Demon's Souls, Miyazaki has always remarked how he was drawn to the project specifically because it was a total disaster, which meant that he could take it over and shape it to be his creative vision. When I've talked about this in previous videos, I've remarked on how the conditions in Demon's Souls were just excellent for somebody like Miyazaki to step up, but I'd never given much thought as to why Miyazaki was attracted to it, and seeing how the Miyazaki instincts aren't 100% coming through in this Miyazaki game, I wonder if he felt too constrained by Nabeshima when directing Armored Core 4. You can feel the Miyazaki-isms in Armored Core 4, but it is being filtered through the lens of conventional Armored Core design principles, which I figure are coming from Nabeshima. I'll talk more about these contrasting styles as we proceed, just wanted to note that this is one of the most interesting reasons to go back and play this game. Armored Core 4 takes place in a world which has undergone a period of rapid population growth. The resources and foodstuffs have not been able to keep up with the increased population, and the economic conditions have seen a massive widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. These factors contributed to a deep sense of unease worldwide, and when violence finally began to break out, the governments of the world were not able to quell it. This premise is very in keeping with what you'd expect from FromSoftware. This is the studio that made the anti-war war mech game 2 years before Kojima did, after all, and there's really nothing in this setup which screams Miyazaki. Since the formal seats of power in this universe have failed, people turned to the corporations to impose social order and to push back against the growth of terrorist groups and the spread of chaos. The corporations answered the call with their private armies, and eventually the 6 most powerful corporations decided to formally put an end to the lingering governmental bodies and have replaced them with their own order. This was the National Dismantlement War. The longer this series has been running, the more I feel they really put in the legwork to establish the contexts which justify the conflicts in their stories. In Armored Core 1, mankind was secretly being ruled by an AI which had set up corporations to put a face on its activities, and the mech warfare grew out of the conflicts between the corporations. The revelation there was followed by an assault on the AI which saw the power to command mankind be returned into human hands. But in Armored Core 2, we saw that absent the AI, the mech warfare kept chugging along. The corporate powers sent to terraform Mars had done such a good job that the neck, stretching from Earth to Mars, could no longer be squeezed to rein in the madness on the Red Planet. After the mech warfare reached the boiling point, Earth sent a force to impose order, and it was led by Leos Klein, the hero of Isaac City from the first generation, who had his own ideas about governing man. AI or not, the mech warfare seemed to crop up wherever humans came, and the comparatively simple message of the first game became much more complex because Klein had not only overthrown the AI himself, but he was now also fighting the human government, and he was desperately in need of some sort of power which could be placed above mankind to protect it from itself. The third game ventured back into the premise of the first game with the AI controlling things, but its existence and purpose was now open knowledge, and the corporations were no longer controlled by it. There's a running idea in that game that the AI is beginning to make mistakes and break down, and each of the world's different factions had their own ideas about how to go about living in the light of that dilemma. This license really likes to explore the relationship between human beings and governments. Communities versus corporations, the line separating them, and the idea of power. In this game, the National Dismantlement War came about because the established governmental bodies failed to address the problems which mankind desperately needed solving. So, the corporations destroyed the forces of the nation-states, and they did so within a single month. After destroying the old governments, the corporations created a new system for global order which they dubbed the Pax Economica, cementing that the era's political dominance would be determined by the corporations. Under the Pax Economica, the people of the world are made to be loyal to the corporations in exchange for guaranteed safety and food. But as is often the case in the Armored Core license, the governing system of the world has no regard for human beings, and the people of the world are being shipped around to live and work in different colonies organized by the corporations, and the living conditions are basically corporate slavery. Story-wise, if we look at the broad themes of Armored Core 4, there's not really a lot of changes from what we've seen before. There is a power organizing the world which is doing a hack job of it. Mankind is made to fight one another with mechs, and eventually we will have to face off against the established global suzerain and remove it to usher in a new era for humanity. In the Armored Core license, social order is contingent upon the perpetuation of the mech economy, and every time mankind has really struck out and tried to change the power dynamic which imposes this upon them, it's usually followed by a deeper realization of how truly ingrained within the human soul the mech economy really is. When the AI is in control, you get the mech economy. When the corporations are in control, you get the mech economy, and when the governments are in control, power flows out of their hands into the entities underneath them, which is where we once again get the mech economy. As much as you can look at the variations on the power structures across this license and how the developers maybe cared more about justifying the happenings in the game than they did trying to establish the license as having a brand of violence. We're 4 generations in now, and seeing how every problem eventually escalates to the point that the human beings in this franchise just get into gigantic mechs and start blowing each other up, it imparts a kind of flavor on the happenings in the Armored Cores, and you can't help but feel like the license definitely has a certain attitude towards humanity. And even though this game does very much follow in the footsteps of the games which came before it, something interesting about the setup in Armored Core 4 is how, even though they are clearly being repressed, the budding Miyazaki-isms are still coming through the cracks. When you boot up the game, you get the menu cinematic, and my god, this is just the opening to Demon's Souls. Also, they just reused it for 2007's Another Centuries episode. Anyways, you flip through the game settings, go through the tutorial, name your pilot, select your mech, watch a short cutscene, and do the first mission. There is a lot of different ways to approach Armored Core 4, and if you decide on going with a specific build or tactic, you might actually want to change up the controls to optimize a certain approach over another. Which is to say, I think it's kinda nice that the game's settings is the first screen we see when we start a new game. The tutorial is nothing remarkable. I mean, they teach you the concepts in a good order, build on top of the knowledge they imparted in the previous tutorial, basic stuff. But the presence of this tutorial is notable because we hadn't really had these dedicated tutorial sections before, and because in Armored Core 4 we get a completely overhauled control scheme. Forward-thinking ideas like analog stick control in a 2006 game are why the master Miyazaki is in fact the master Miyazaki. Hallelujah. Naming the mech pilot is nothing significant, but getting to select a mech is primo stuff. Back in the pre-PlayStation games, I'm talking back in the 80s here, FromSoftware was an office software developer, and they made the change to video games because Notoshi Jin, or someone else high up in the studio, played wizardry and figured that this was what they needed to do. They released their first game, Kingsfield, on the PlayStation 1, but this wasn't the initial idea. They were actually planning to make a game about little robots traveling around in tunnels, and if you look at the footage from the first Armored Core, check out my cool video on it if you haven't already, you can kind of see how that small robots in caves idea morphed into Armored Core. The reason Kingsfield came out first is because Armored Core was conceived of as a PC game meant for a more hardcore PC audience. And so, the bizarre amount of customization options and build choices this series has always given to the player makes sense when you realize that this started out as a more mech simulator PC game, which was then reconfigured for a console audience because they needed the CD-ROM technology of the PlayStation 1 for the first game to actually run. And now, 4 games in, there are some quality of life considerations in the opening because the series about letting us customize our own mechs finally let us choose more than one preset at the start, which makes the transition from the starting mech to your ideal build so much easier. The first mission is framed as an audition. The small and scrappy little colony, Anatolia, needs to show the big corporations that they are actually worth taking a financial interest in because they can get the job you hire them out for done better than anyone else can. Griffin City was abandoned and has been occupied by terrorists. The companies want us to clear out the city so that they can rebuild it. This is yet another example of us clearing out squatters because they are holding back the corporate interests' land redevelopment plans, starting missions, which we've seen a lot of from this license already, but we finally hit the point where the story isn't weaponizing the mission against the player to make a point about its larger themes. In the first game, the squatters were laid off workers which we destroyed without second thought because the game's developers needed to gamify the mech economy. In the third game, the vicious mech economy sentiment which the player had been inducted into in previous entries was also made into the perspective of the other people in the universe, and so everyone was harming everyone else for their own self-interest, and in the process, everyone was feeding the mech economy. Here, there are actual terrorists who have taken over a city, and we are clearing them out to offer up the city to one of our corporate benefactors in order to make a name for ourselves and continue to feed our home colony. Yeah, We're not doing things to get rich or whatever the motivations were before. We take actions in this game because there are people depending on us. You might even say that for the first time, we might be playing as the good guy. Fancy that. The world created by the Pax Economica is a world of colonies organized to return hefty profit to their corporate overlords. Prior to the events of this game, one of the colonies, Anatolia, had managed to stay afloat and stay independent because of the revenue they received from the inventions of the next engineer, Professor Jarnefeld. But things took a turn when he finally kicked the bucket and Anatolia was plunged into a severe economic crisis. In their desperation, they turned to mercenary work to pay the bills. This is where we come in. We are the Anatolia Raven, and our operator is one Fiona Jarnefeld, daughter of Professor Jarnefeld. The game has not completely dropped nuance in its perspective on warfare or the human condition in the world they've set up, but it continues the tradition of the license so far by actually humanizing the conflict and grasping out for some sort of sincerity to hold on to. Armored Core 3 gave all of the factions their own perspectives on the overarching conflict, but we were still navigating the world in that game through another variation of the Raven's Nest. Sure, our operator there would think about the ramifications of our actions and meditate a bit on the game's themes in the email screens, but she would basically always take our side, so the global cortex felt very much like it had its own morality imposed on it by the actions we took. Anatolia is not a philosophically or morally blank mission granter, and Fiona is also not a passive operator. She worries about what the path we've chosen is doing to our home, and she has her own perspectives which are independent of us, and the needs imposed on her by the gameplay. She doesn't tell us to kill to get money just because the game's systems are set up for that. If Lane Mayers was the Firekeeper from Dark Souls 3, then Fiona is Melina on crack. Contemporary FromSoft obsession with female companion level ladies might be a holdover from Armored Core. The ladies all look like Rurufon from Shadow Tower Abyss, but their function is 100% what it was in Armored Core. In fact, the whole Raven's Nest interface has been retrofitted and characterized in the Souls games to wrap around the save hubs and the characters we meet there. So in those games we get stronger by buying weapons from merchants or leveling up with the help of the leveling ladies. In Armored Core we get stronger by buying new mech parts, and it's the same basic structure, but here we interact more abstractly with the world through a filter of interfaces rather than walking around in 3D space and talking to the characters standing in front of us. There are no missions which take us out of the mechs, and if the character interactions or shopping or mech customizations actually required us to walk around a garage or something like that, that could pretty quickly become very boring. So abstracting all of this and presenting it with a menu interface is a nice and economic touch. Also, it adds a layer of depersonalization. Fiona is our closest companion in the game, and I don't even know what she looks like. Is this presentation format downstream of the game world's disregardful attitude to humanity, or was it the other way around? Whatever the case, this cold and depersonalized presentation format is a series staple, and it is cool to see it return. You know what else is cool? Anatolia. The games have gotten progressively more sincere, and now we're at a point where the faceless middleman mission provider from previous entries is why we're fighting in the first place. An assault on the Raven's Nest would never have been enough to twist the player's arm in the first game, but Anatolia and the player character's attachment to the place is leaned into several times to drum up some emotional stakes. The Armored Core attitude seems to have finally fully shifted from people can be terrible to people can do terrible things under terrible conditions. We're not a soulless, money-grubbing ghoul this time around, and there's really no pretense that that's the narrative we'll be operating under. Like I said earlier, the third Armored Core took that setup and extrapolated it across its entire universe so that even though we were still taking paychecks and perpetuating the mech economy while destroying civilian lives, in the third game, the civilians were also doing that. They were trying to keep weapons factories open. I suppose since they realized that sentiment so fully in the third game, it didn't really make a lot of sense to bring it back in Armored Core 4. So this time around, there is no meta-narrative condemnation about how your participation in the system is perpetuating the evil system. You participate because your colony would die if you didn't. And you don't just extend the rule of the evil powers. This game is all about destroying the Pax Economica. And the revelation from this game isn't so much a knife in the back, as it is the sad observation that the Link's war itself is contaminating the planet with Kojima particles, and rather than some evil AI or company, it is this contamination which spurs on the narrative in the next game. Yeah, Miyazaki managed to make the Armored Core series not about the inherent human will to mech warfare, but about the corrupting byproduct of the bloodshed. We break apart the established social order of this world, and in doing so, in violating this boundary, corruption begins to seep into the world in the form of those Kojima particles. Mechs is how we'll break the Pax Economica, and mechs are what causes the Kojima contamination, which caused the corruption of the planet. The madman actually made Armored Core 4 about Kegare. Throughout the early game, we fight some anti-establishment groups, and eventually, when we have defeated the Maghrib Liberation Front's pilot Amazigh, our reputation is rocketed upwards and we become a prized entity in the eyes of the different corporations. In keeping with the more sincere tone this time around, Fiona is shown to be somewhat concerned with that development. Chapter 2 has decent mission variety, and ending it with a mech fight feels kind of like a graduation into the rest of the game. You've proven you can pilot the mech, but are you fast enough to keep up with another mech? If you had to explain away the characteristic difference which separates the Gen 4 Armored Cores from the older titles, the word you're looking for is fast. Maybe you'd throw in airborne, maybe damage, maybe even targeting, but fast really encompasses all those other differences, so that's probably the best word. Every design decision, mission gameplay-wise, seems to make sense if it's there to compensate for the added speed. Take the original Armored Core and make it 10 times faster. Now the player has to work around having very tanky and clunky mobility. No problem, just reassign the movement to the analog sticks. Now we have snappy and responsive movement, but oh no, every other non-stationary entity in the game has it as well, and the player can't keep up. No problem, power up the boosters and let the player hover without expending any energy, and the firefights feel very glidey and slick. The problem then is that the lock-on system is struggling to keep up with the enemies because the camera is snappier and the enemies are zippier. This is solved by overhauling the lock-on from previous games. Now the tracking screen has been scaled up to cover what feels like the entire monitor display area, and to keep the combat visible, the tracking screen has also been made invisible. The lock-on is stronger the closer the enemy is to the center of the screen, and the range governing our lock-on is now set by the FCS rather than the weapon itself. If you open up the spreadsheets, you'll see a stat called melee ability, and that's what's determining how strong our lock-on is. And this is the governing variable because melee is arguably more important than ever before, because the insanely amped up speed has minimized the time spent in the encounters and bloated out the spacing time, the time you spend positioning yourself before striking. And so the fights are optimized around dealing as much damage with each strike. And because of this, every weapon also seems to do a lot more damage than they did in previous titles. To smooth out the commitment to an engagement, we now have the Quick Boost, which quickly nudges the player into any cardinal direction. It won't help much against rapid gunfire, but missiles and lasers and such are easier to dodge now than ever before. For you, and for the enemy mechs, meaning if you bring those sorts of weapons to a fight, you need to angle yourself pretty well to line up a good shot, and the Quick Boost and the general increased emphasis on flight actually helps out with that as well. Since there's more damage being dealt, and since maneuverability is so liberated from before, it obviously makes sense to also have some destructible environmental clutter, like buildings in the maps for the player to retreat to if they decide they need better ground, or if they want to change the angle of their assault against the enemy. The clutter does block enemy fire, but since it's destructible, you need to keep moving. Also, a lot of this stuff can be broken by boosting into it, which helps sell the weight of the combat somewhat. All of these recalibrations to the formula seem to track nicely with making the old games play faster, but something which could have been lost in the shuffle was the Armored Core sentiment I've been raving about in all of these videos. That being, because of the clunky controls, it always felt more like we were playing the pilot rather than the mech. One expression of this sentiment which has been removed this time around is the explosive HUD they introduced in the second game. The control scheme in the old Armored Cores was pretty primitive, and since those games were going for that borderline simulator mentality, one way they helped sell the player on the idea that they were piloting the mech was with the customizable heads-up display, which simulates a lot of the complexity, gets you into the headspace of actually being in a cockpit, and gives you a lot of data about the battle area which you could actually make tactical use of. It was largely superfluous stuff, but its function seems to me at least to have been immersion building, and I appreciate it more on that level than for whatever information it gave me in the middle of a firefight. Though I'll note that there was also some really cool tech you could get out of that thing, like tracking enemy ammo or their heat. The HUD, this time around, is very streamlined and generic, but because the minute-to-minute gameplay is so much more hectic, I don't feel like this game would have benefited as much from the inclusion of a HUD like in the second game. Firstly, with how fast things are here, the HUD would probably just get in the way. Secondly, the control scheme is powerful enough that I don't feel like the game really needs a crazy bloated HUD to compensate for the lack of borderline simulator approach to mech combat. If we charted the games on a graph, this is definitely the least you play as the pilot, not the mech, out of any of the Armored Cores up until this point, but the approach taken here where the nexts are presented as semi-divine interventions complete with operatic music and elegant slow-motion camera work, which is almost glorifying the surgical destruction, this approach to the mech fantasy is not exactly a downgrade. Armored Core 5 would slow things down again, significantly, but after so many minor tweaks to the old formula which we'd been getting over the years, it is really cool to see everything dialed so radically into a different direction this time around that I'm not really feeling the urge to decry this game as some sort of disgrace. Dark Souls took the formula from Demon Souls and recalibrated it to fit a more lost-in-the-world mood by making the world interconnected and introducing mechanics like Estes, which freed the player from a dependence on one major hub. Bloodborne took the formula for Demon Souls and honed in on combat for player direction. The rallying mechanic rewards and incentivizes players to duke it out just a bit longer. Those games are very much using the Demon Souls formula, but they emphasize different elements of the core gameplay to elevate different kinds of experiences. In that same way, Armored Core 4 is using the core formula of the original Armored Core, but because it has different creative ambitions, it recalibrates the values under the hood to try to deliver on a different kind of experience. If it had originally launched as something other than Armored Core, the detractors who said it ruined the franchise would have probably really loved it, because it wouldn't have had to deliver on the expectations those detractors, somewhat reasonably, brought in because of their familiarity with the license. As the game progresses, the corporate wars advance and things begin to escalate until GA hires us to destroy the prototype weapon platforms which are being developed by their own European subsidiaries in response to them announcing their secession from the group. Aquavit, another corporation, has close ties with GA Europe and considers the assault to be a direct attack on them and officially declare war against GA. This destabilizes the entire Pax Economica, and the other corporations, all smelling blood and opportunity for advancement, all declare war on one another, leading to the global military crisis referred to in this game as the Lynx War. When it comes to story progression, the Armored Cores have always had the corporate/organizational warfare escalate in the background in tandem with us completing more missions. The old complete missions to get money to get mech parts to be better at the missions loop is in this game, but it's not as pronounced because the game is a lot more lenient than previous entries. Human Plus does not return, so there's no penalty to failing missions other than failing the missions and having to retry it. Players don't even lose any money when they fail missions here. Also, they get paid a lot more money than ever before, and since everything sells for the same price it's bought for, once the player has collected about 1 million Armored Core bucks, they can swap things out on their mechs and pay for whatever difference is missing by selling the parts they've just unequipped. There's clearly less and less an emphasis on committing to your build as these games have progressed, and even though my beloved Human Plus and the ruthless characterization of the mech economy is gone this time around, the shift of focus to instead highlight the build variety and experimentation opens up some doors when it comes to designing the missions because the punishment for failure has been lowered so much. It's true that a lot of the game direction is gone in the economy department, but even though I really like the older setup, the setup to the economy in this game really emphasizes the idea that, more so than ever before, war can be very lucrative. And as the Lynx War goes on, the player kills many originals, next fighters who have been active since the National Dismantlement War, and they also get introduced to Joshua O'Brien, who's the best character in the game. So he's a friend of Fiona's, and like the player, he's another mercenary who takes on missions in the corporate wars to keep his home colony Aspina financially afloat. The missions in this game are a standout selection even for this franchise. In my video on the third game, I spent a lot of time detailing missions I quite liked there, and I'm loath to pad this video by doing it again, but man, this is directed by the man who made Demon's Souls, and you kinda feel it. It's on par with the missions from Armored Core 3. That's how solid a grasp of the game direction they had here, and that is kinda notable because this is the first formulation of these recalibrated mechanics, whereas the third game was building on top of years of Armored Core games and lessons learned there. Because Armored Core 4 is much faster and because there's more of an emphasis on flight, the old best practices in mission design would not float anymore. The core formula has changed too much and it imposes new standards for excellence in mission design. If there is one trait which Miyazaki absolutely excels at as a game designer, it is scenario direction. Demon's Souls was an eco-fication of the old Kingsfields, and since it's a slow sword and shield dungeon crawler exported into the third person, the best scenario direction there was in the ambushes and how they were set up, and how the levels all leaned on the specifics of their biome theming when it came to shortcuts, enemies, and locks on progress. Armored Core 4 emphasizes speed, so timed missions where we're chasing down submarines before they can sink a ship we're protecting are great. The levels which take advantage of our boost and the open maps are also great. The developers will at times drop the player into the middle of a gigantic firefight and the game decides to become a shmup. The mechanics allowed for it, so they just went for it. There's also a lot of very distinct scenarios here, like that one mission which has us enter an area to clear out some enemies. Simple stuff, except it's pitch dark and our support team is periodically firing flares to light up the place. We dart in and out of cover and have to triangulate the enemy positions and predict where best to situate ourselves in the dunes, and it's such a good mission! You'd think the emphasis on flight would mean that the player could just fly over the map at all times and ignore the scenarios which the level designers had carefully assembled, but map borders, targets we must protect, objectives, gimmicks, and the fact that flight always makes us more exposed means that isn't really the case. The maps are often much more open than in previous games, and missions like when we destroy the Queenslands really take advantage of that. It takes place in the ocean, and it's full of ships constantly firing at us. We need to cross the sea to the end of the area to destroy the Queenslands, and depending on your build, you might want to fly above and quick boost around the gunfire, or you might want to use the ships which are very much shooting at you as cover from the other ships. Typically, I find the best levels in games are the ones that lean the most on the core fundamentals of those games and take advantage of the unique mechanics or gimmicks that game has going for itself. Racing backwards through a tunnel while fighting off a superweapon intent on destroying Anatolia wouldn't have worked in previous Armored Cores, so it feels really liberating to do it here. Memorizing the dune hills and positioning yourself for cover against enemies in the pitch dark wouldn't have worked as well in previous games because fine-tuned positioning was not really a thing back then. And traveling over a fleet of destroyers to reach and destroy the Queenslands wouldn't have been nearly as cool in previous games because without such a heavy emphasis on speed and flight, there would have been no way of guaranteeing every build could have reasonably made this crossing, and so if it had to work back then, it would have had to have been scaled way down. That might have made for an interesting mission in its own right, but it would have been interesting in a different way, and the experience would have felt very different. Armored Core 4's emphasis on speed removes the limiting factor of previous games and opens up a whole new dimension for mission design. The slow, drawn-out and moody tunnel sections are sadly gone, but the trade-off is vast battlefields and skies filled with enemies. Every mission has a much more epic scope than before, and you actually begin to feel like the combat is what the operatic menu cinematic portrayed it as being. The game hasn't pulled any punches in the franchise's meditation on violence, but whatever was lost in the characterization with the softening up of the in-game economy and the cynical attitude of the characters we engage with is made up for with how glorious it feels to control the mechs and rain death down on the enemies. Nabeshima's sensibility throughout the Armored Core series had resulted in games whose mech fantasy was more about the fantasy of being the pilot than it was being the mech, and the attitude of the world in the older games was imparted to the player with the layered world design, the hidden failure states, and the email interactions. Miyazaki's directorial style is more about imparting to the players the feeling of accomplishment from overcoming an obstacle. To that end, we are no longer made complicit with the evil mech economy because of the paychecks we search for when we accept the missions. We're made complicit because there's no way of playing the game without having a lot of fun. The old Armored Cores did their flexing here, but Armored Core 4 largely gets rid of that and imparts the experience to the player in the missions themselves. And it still works to impart that same sensibility, and it still feels very much like Armored Core. I've heaped praise on the direction in the Queensland's mission, but I haven't really talked about why it's important to the story. The Lynx War has been escalating ever since the Pax Economica peace broke down, and when we destroy the Queensland's ship, we are actually assassinating the top brass of the Bernard and Felix Foundation. And this changes everything because we've basically single-handedly taken out one of the major corporations, and like how it always is in the Armored Cores, when we've made too much noise and made too big a name for ourselves, the entities in the world decide that it's best to take us out rather than to allow us to continue to operate. Enter the Urs Ragna, a moving fortress which was sent by Aquavit to destroy Anatolia. We intercept and destroy the weapon, and our buddy Joshua O'Brien will destroy Aquavit's headquarters while we destroy Exaville, the headquarters of the Ray Leonard Company. With that, the Lynx War comes to an end, and we and Fiona set out to take a break. But this is short-lived because Anatolia gets attacked by none other than Joshua O'Brien, now piloting the prototype 00 Aretha next. We fight him, and we see arguably the best utilization of the license's world design and themes in a character up until this point, in that when the fight begins, Joshua starts by talking about how there's no need for words, and then he gets right to business. If Joshua kills us in this mission, he'll tell us that he'll be right behind us and that we can chew him out on the other side. And if we kill him, he says that it's probably for the best. You see what I mean about this guy? The relationships in Armored Core are built in combat, and even though O'Brien and we actually like each other, the fact that we have different buyers means that we are made to kill one another, and it really sucks because Joshua was a nice guy and we did pretty good work ending the Lynx War together. Supplementary material to the game hints that he had actually been hired by the Omer science technology to raze Anatolia to the ground in order to destroy us, but it really doesn't matter because this is like the 6th major company I've introduced while going over the story, and you see that it's just the same thing over and over again. There was no deep reason for the assault, and there was no reason for Joshua to die other than one of the lingering corporations was scared and they thought they'd succeed in defeating us, where all the other entities had failed. The prototype which O'Brien was piloting places immense stress on the pilot, so it might even be that they were not just trying to get rid of us, but of both us and O'Brien. O'Brien is the realization of the protagonist's design from earlier games. We are given a lot of rationalizations for how our interaction with the mech economy doesn't make us a bad guy, and even though his story is mirroring our own, in the end he doesn't make it over the hump that we do. He ends up being more loyal to a paycheck than he is to his friends. To us. And actually, if you hard mode the missions, you can see this characterization reinforced because he'll actually show up in earlier missions from time to time as paid opposition. So, in O'Brien, we get the conventional Armored Core protagonist who is doing a bad thing reveal without undermining the efforts and earlier characterization of the Anatolia mercenary and Fiona. So like I said earlier, we are, for once in an Armored Core game, playing as the good guy. Right? Well, I talked earlier about how the Lynx War leads to the Kojima contamination, but I haven't actually talked much about the Kojima particles in this video so far. The heat mechanic introduced in Armored Core 2 has been removed, and instead, the gimmick attached to the combat this time around is the Kojima particles and primal armor. Kojima particles are glowing green particles which can be used to power machinery. But Kojima particles also cause erosion damage and Kojima contamination. That is their utility in combat. They do a lot of damage, but the contamination left behind from conflict, which involves weaponry utilizing the Kojima particles, the contamination left behind does tremendous environmental damage. That environmental damage part is notable because this means the use of the primal armor system is outright banned near the inhabited zones, and like I said earlier, by the time of For Answer, the Kojima contamination of the Lynx War will begin to catch up with humanity. An interesting component of the Kojima particles is that they turn solid when they collide with one another. This feature allows them to be used to create the primal armor. In universe, the primal armor system was created when scientists were designing the Nexts, and managed to actually contain the Kojima particles in the shape of a sphere which hovers around the actual armored core. So if anything tries to penetrate the shield, it will be damaged before making impact with the object behind the shield, if it is not destroyed by the shield outright. This obviously changes the landscape of warfare drastically and shakes up what exactly the optimal way to engage in warfare is. For example, energy-based weapons do better at penetrating the shields than physical-based weapons do. So those weapons tend to be selected when there is a choice between the two. The primal armor is damaged every time it absorbs an attack, and if it is breached, the next will be vulnerable, while the PA recharges. These particles are a new addition to the license, and they kind of break away from series tradition. The first game was a clunky post-apocalyptic cyberpunk game, and while the style evolved and the tech got slicker in subsequent entries, you still got that feeling from those games. Armored Core 2 took the series to Mars, but it wasn't so much because of a sci-fi MacGuffin discovered there, as much as it was just an excuse to isolate the conflict away from the Earth government, to contextualize the organizations and the mech warfare. The food crisis and the Pax Economica do that job here, so it's interesting that they also introduced a magical sci-fi element in these particles. I wonder if they just wanted to have an in-game explanation for the primal armor system, or if the idea of warfare corrupting the planet came first. The Lynx War makes the distribution of power variable on a minute-to-minute basis, and the formalizing is done with the mech warfare, which secretes these toxic particles around. That's the in-universe sci-fi rationalization, but thematically, we might be looking at the dangers of the order of the world being broken, and if that's the case, then the case for Anatolia's mercenary putting down the Pax Economica should be questioned, because, as we've seen in previous titles, a flawed order might be better than no order at all. If the Anatolia mercenary does not take the reins of power after the Pax Economica has been destroyed, it's not guaranteed that what follows will be better than the colonial exploitative slavery system which humanity's got going for itself during the Pax Economica. Those organizations obtained their power because they were willing to address the food shortages and terrorist problems which the previous governments were unable to solve, and If all the Anatolia mercenary does is pull back the clock on the Pax Economica, what happens next? Will the forces repressed by the Pax Economica rise to terrorize the vulnerable world? Will mankind work together for a new order? Or will the new order only be brought about by the sword? The Kojima contamination is still around. Is this universe in for centuries of a drawn-out, unorganized torment at the hands of those who refuse to abide by the order of the world? Did the ambitions of Anatolia doom the planet, or set it up for a new golden age? These are complex questions, but if you really want to know, stay tuned for the Armored Core 4 Answer Retrospective. If you feel Armored Core is a franchise defined by its visuals or by its presentation format, then Armored Core 4 did ruin the franchise. It sent the trajectory of future games into wildly different directions from what came before, and even though there would be a course correction in Armored Core 5, the damage was arguably already done. Once the series has moved away from its origins once, it can't really go back. If they'd try to walk back the style and completely reappropriate what came before, they'd be doing so in the light of massive criticism and with hindsight knowledge of what the license does not excel at. And this fear of the 4th generation games would permeate whatever new titles they'd cook up and might forever shackle the creative scope of the series. The Armored Cores had always experimented, but with 4, it was clear that they'd gone too far, and knowing that there is a too far and having already crossed that line once, means the license might never again embody what made people fall in love with it in the first place. If you feel Armored Core is a franchise defined by its visuals or by its presentation format, then Armored Core 4 did ruin the franchise. But if you disagree with this assessment and you feel Armored Core is defined by the sentiment expressed, rather than the visuals or the gameplay which express it, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that Armored Core 4 is anything less than a knockout entry. For myself, I fall squarely in the second category, and while I don't think this is the best Armored Core game, I do think this game is on par with the third one. It's such a wonderful and rich realization of the license, and it was the perfect case study in modernizing a rapidly aging series. Fires of Rubicon is not launched as of the writing of this video, but it will be made by the studio which made this game, and one can dream that it can pull the same trick this game did back in 2006. Hopefully, lightning indeed strikes twice. Don't click away from this video just yet. If you want to support the channel and get early access to videos, including the Grass vs Estes debate, be sure to visit the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Videos like this one can take a lot of time to assemble, and any support you can give is massively appreciated. Once I've finished editing the 4 Answer Retrospective, it will launch early there, and the subsequent Armored Core Retrospectives, that's 5, Verdict Day, and Fires of Rubicon, will also all make an early appearance there. If there's enough interest, I might make a video going over the early gen spin-off titles, and I might also make a big series overview style video at the end of the development of the solo videos to cap things off. If you're interested in those, the link to the Patreon is in the video description. Consider fueling the mech game hyperfixation. Also, don't forget that I'm still working on my game. It's so tantalizingly close to being finalized, but I had to put it on hold for a couple of months while I bang out these Armored Core videos. I'll get back around to it in September when I've done everything I wanted to do with Armored Core, and hopefully it'll be the final detour from the YouTube channel before the game is ready. If you want to follow up on the development of the game, be sure to check out the Discord link in the description. Also, if you don't care about the game, you should still check out the Discord link because we all have a lot of fun on the Friends of Aesir Discord channel. And that's a much better optimized interface for more long-form discussions about the games I talk about in these videos than the YouTube commenting system is. That said, be sure to still leave those comments if you want to ask me about anything, or if you believe the video was good enough to warrant increasing the engagement. Helps tell the algorithm to share the retrospective around. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.